So I want to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on Aboriginal lands. I pay my respects to the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples who are the custodians of these lands. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to do so actually through this lecture, by really thinking through what it means to care for a place and a community, and what it means to be attached to that place and that community. So this year's Hillier lecture is about a term that's really kind of common in academia, but people don't often talk about until it's too late sometimes, and that's gentrification. And that's this process where rents and property values rise so quickly in a neighborhood that what had previously been affordable is no longer affordable, leading to rapid change. So why are we talking about this at the Nancy Hillier Memorial Lecture? Nancy was, after all, best known for her environmental activism. To talk about this, I'd actually like to show you some images that Bayside Council Libraries historians Alison Wishart and Kristen Broderick dug up and shared with me. Anybody know what this is?
A house.
Yes, it is a house. Excellent. You know whose house it was? Yes, sir. That was Nancy Hillier's house. Absolutely right. At 3 Queen Street here in Botany, right between Morgan and Hambley. Nancy and Ernest Hillier purchased the land on the 10th of October 1950 as part of the Hancock's Garden development for what was then around 390 pounds. That's $21,000 in today's Australian dollar. Think about that. 2 years later, the home that they built was assessed at being valued at around 1,900 pounds. That's around $74,000 in today's money.
How did you get more records?
You know, the Botany Library historians actually have a troop of ninjas. So they also collect on your library fees, so be careful. So obviously, Sydney is a long way from the days when a working couple can afford to buy a home for the equivalent of $74,000. And of course, with every neighborhood in Australia, we've seen a real transformations, and these transformations are sometimes good and sometimes challenging, right? Indeed, Botany wouldn't have the quality of life it enjoys now but for the efforts of Nancy Hillier and a lot of other folks who toiled protecting that quality of life, including our first speaker tonight, Ron Honig. Right? This is something we hope for. But at the same time, right, when the pace of change grows so fast, we run risks of losing the very things that might have drawn us to a neighborhood originally, including the people who took risks there. Artists, small business owners, activists like Nancy are among the people who go out on a limb, who take risks to make a place great. But if they can't afford to stay in the place that they've invested in, it becomes a problem. And so this is a topic that whenever I brought it up, people would say, oh yeah, gentrification. But then they'd start warming to it and say, oh yeah, I remember, yeah, there was this family that we used to spend a lot of time with and they moved away. There was this shifting demographics or shifting participation in local clubs. And so this is one of these things that seems to be particularly relevant right now. And at the risk of being on the nose, I was actually talking to Nancy's son, Clive, who you'll be hearing from shortly. Clive was just evicted from his stained glass studio just down the road at 1544 Botany to make way for more units. Right? So these are transformations that always happen. But I think it's good to have a conversation about the direction and the speed with which they do happen. So before we start this conversation and these wonderful panel, I do want to thank some of the people who made tonight possible. The Bayside librarian historians were a huge help, including finding a number of these wonderful documents, including Alison Wishart and Kristen Broderick. Bayside Council, I want to thank Dr. Christina Curry, the mayor, so much. Bobby Main helped this happen. She is the Meryl Streep of getting things done in Bayside. I don't think there's anything she doesn't do well. So thank you. I'd like to thank Greg Baker and the facilities folks, my colleague Matt Cairns, who's here, as well as the Environment Society Group at UNSW, Tyra Mowbray at School of Humanities and Languages, our panelists, and actually I want to mention the caterers as well. If you liked the food is from House of Welcome. They're a purpose-driven business that actually employs refugees and asylum seekers, gives them training and job opportunities. So if you like the food, remember that name. Thank you, yeah. Thank you. And finally, I would like to thank all of you for being curious and caring enough to come out on a Thursday night for this discussion. And with that, I would like to introduce our own, Bayside's own mayor, Dr. Christina Curry. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Got to get mic'd up for the recording. Okay, we're good. Thank you, Dr. Carr. And what a joy it is to be in Botany Town Hall. I think this is where this lecture series really belongs. So yeah, well done to everyone involved. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to elders past and present. And on behalf of Bayside Council, I thank you all for coming here this evening. I'd like to acknowledge Ron Honig, member for Heffron, who's here, my fellow councillors Jo Jansen and Jenny Muscat. Liz Barlow, she weren't sitting there. Councillor Liz Barlow, Clive Hillier, and in recognition of your wonderful mother, and the Botany Historical Trust too, and all our other guests here today. I think everyone who lives in Botany knows the late Nancy Hillier OAM, the amazing person she was, and the work that she did for the community and for the local environment. I remember sitting with Nancy Hillier when I first was elected in 2012 at Mascot Library, and had the opportunity to sit with her and just hear some of the stories, and she was it was just so, for me, I was just so inspired by it, and it was very encouraging to, to learn about, although I was a local, so I was well aware, but to have the opportunity to sit with her, I'm very grateful for that. Bayside Council is proud to continue honouring and hosting the annual Nancy Hillier Memorial Lecture, which is kindly organised by the University of New South Wales. And I believe the series commenced in 2016 and has proved to be, I know we had a bit of a touch and go with COVID and things like that, but it's proved to be a valuable forum to discuss issues that are really important and that affect our community. And the series brings together local governments, special interest groups, educational institutions. The lectures have helped in forging these links across these groups for students and researchers over the years, and what rich, research there is in our history. So, as you're all aware, local government is faced with many social, environmental and economic issues. We cannot solve those without community input. We need people to come forward in the way that Nancy did. Her work provides inspiration for any resident who wants to get involved in community issues and decision-making processes. If Nancy saw an injustice or felt that the government leaders were taking the wrong path, she did not hesitate in coming forward and taking a stand. Some of her most vocal campaigns involved the expansion of the airport and Port Botany and fighting for the environmental survival of our beautiful Botany Bay. I'd like to quote Nancy. "A lot of people don't want to complain because they don't want the name of a whinger. It doesn't bother me. It would bother me if I don't speak up." And that was true to Nancy's word. And if they didn't listen, there's a saying that says she fought them on the streets and in the courts. I believe she was told she would be shot and her house broken into twice. she nevertheless continued to fight. She was indeed a very special person, kind, passionate, and courageous. Tonight's topic, taking control of gentrification in South Sydney, is very appropriate. With Sydney amongst the least affordable housing markets on earth, our neighbourhood through the city has been substantially altered, with South Sydney particularly impacted. While rising home prices bring both benefits and burdens to neighbourhoods, the question facing Sydney is not whether gentrification is occurring, but how we actually respond to it. Nancy Hillier would not have been afraid to stand up and share her wisdom and knowledge on tonight's topic. I'm sure our speakers here tonight will bring similar enthusiasm and passion to our lecture tonight. And I know that it's wonderful here to have Ron Honig, who was Mayor of Botany Bay for 31 years, and you know what he did as well, and I know worked closely with Nancy to change this area into now one of the most sought after areas where people want to live. So I'm looking forward to the lively discussion. Thank you, Nancy, for your inspiration, and I will always be encouraged by your care and commitment to our community. Thank you.
And now on behalf of the Hillier family, I'd like to invite Nancy's son, Clive Hillier, to come up and say a few words. Everybody must wear that.
Yeah, I want to use that if I could. Just click on the collar.
That's right.
Thank you. Tricky. Okay, can everyone hear me? Is that clear enough? Yeah, well, I'll try and speak louder if it's not. Okay. Sorry? Oh, okay. All right, fair enough. Okay, that's a lot clearer. All I can say is wow, wow, and wow. Look at our town hall, isn't it grand? I mean, you know, I've lived in the area on and off for most of my life, and I was saying some of the people earlier, my mother used to drag me along here as a 7-year-old for ballroom dancing lessons. Unfortunately, that didn't work out too well because I was a bit like my mother. I stood on too many toes. So, you know, it's changed a lot. The structure's still the same, but the floors weren't polished and beautiful. And, you know, congratulations to the council on what they've done here. Mum would have been absolutely over the moon about it. On behalf of my late mother and family, we would like to extend our thanks to the University of New South Wales Environment and Society School of Humanities and Languages, in particular to John Carr, who has worked tirelessly to make tonight's event happen. John's been thanking lots of other people, but if it basically wasn't for John, we wouldn't be all here tonight. He's done a magnificent job. I'd like to thank the committee for this year's lecture, chaired by John and the supporting members, and I would also like to thank Mayor Christina Curry, the Bayside Council and staff, pardon me, for their continuing support. Our esteemed and knowledge panel of guest speakers include Ron Honig, MP, former Mayor of Botany for over 30 years. Pardon me for being a bit repetitive, but these thanks are coming from my family. Long-term ally of my late mother and tireless campaigner for his constituents. Also like to welcome Dr. Jemima Mowbray, sorry about that, Policy and Advocacy Manager with the Tenants Union of New South Wales. UTS Professor Alan Morris, author of the book Gentrification and Displacement, the Forced Relocation of Public Housing Tenants in Inner Sydney. Now, we're very fortunate to be able to hold this year's lecture in Botany Town Hall. As you know, the renovation was taking some time due to COVID and all the issues around that. And COVID also forced us into almost a hiatus of 2 years, with the lecture being suspended for that period of time. The last lecture we ran, which was John's first, was done through a Zoom meeting in John's office at Sydney University. Went marvellously well. At least I felt pretty good sitting in front of the computer, not having to look at myself, so that was all great. But that was a fabulous evening. This is just so much better to have the warmth of the people here tonight to share it with us. It was a tough decision to make with that Zoom meeting, but it's proven for the best. There were severe doubts overshadowing the night, actually continuing should the COVID-19 pandemic have continued and not been well managed. This was a safe and well thought through plan, which ensured the guaranteed continuance of the lecture. I cannot speak highly enough the way John has handled this process and laid the groundwork for the continuance of the annual lecture. Nancy would have indeed been very proud of all the efforts on her behalf to keep the flag raised high. Gentrification doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, it's just sort of the complications that go with it. And there's a definition, at the risk of being totally boring, I brought along tonight from the dictionary, saying gentrification is a process in which a poor area, as of in a city, experiences an influx of middle class or wealthy people who renovate and rebuild homes and businesses, and which often results in an increase in property values and displacement of earlier, usually poorer residents. Sounds pretty familiar, but not necessarily absolutely true. It's a bit more complicated than that. My mother campaigned for a better botany. The opportunity came with residential rezoning some years ago, after all the work she'd put in over those years and the forces put on the industrialists in the area to clean their acts up, and it became a little bit too difficult for them. Under the stewardship of Ron Honig, who assisted with that process, Ron undertook a broad plan of rezoning of the area and forced the industry out of the area. Unfortunately, didn't quite clean up ICI and Orica, which are still there, but no one knows what to do with that large problem. Regrettably, with the passing of time, the areas of botany in southern Sydney have fallen victim to the greed of developers and lack of sufficient infrastructure to cope with new residents and watering down of services that were initially available. So the fight goes on. With regards to tonight's topic, Mum would not have been so proud of some of the more obvious deficiencies of gentrification. These are the downsides, and it's not all downsides by any means, however. The excessive and poorly planned development being constructed, high density high rise that now dominates the landscape and has been pushed through no matter what. She would have been devastated by the demolition of the local landmark, the old General Motors tower on the corner of Heffron and Bunurong Roads, Pagewood, to make way for massive commercial and residential towers. This was an architecturally pleasing and well-built structure that showed part of the area's early industrial history and was much loved by many residents. It was to be preserved, however the developer knocked it down very quickly before it could be stopped. The other thing is, botany's been known for as a bit of a dumping ground since the first day settlers came here, and unfortunately, Sydney water's continued pollution of the mill pond, which is part of Sydney's original water supply, and haven to native plants and wildlife. It's just a disgrace that they still continue to use that as a dump for sullage that's overflowed from stormwater. It's pretty, I just get that makes me particularly mad. My mother would have been jumping up and down so much. We also have serious localised flooding as a result of old drainage systems that can no longer cope or be fixed, apparently. She would be particularly disappointed by the demise of public transport with reduced and restricted services to our area, whilst billions have been poured into the light rail and road construction elsewhere. This in spite of more people being crammed into our beloved botany in southern Sydney and the surrounds. Relatively simple things like street lighting don't seem to get fixed anymore. I don't know if you've noticed how many dark streets there are. And even going on the Southern Cross Drive and leaving the airport, you've got strips and strips and strips that are pitch black. Is that because they sold the poles and cables, or is anyone responsible for changing the light bulbs anymore? That's really, it's a joke. It's an embarrassment. It's now 9 years since our beloved mother passed away. Her physical being is no longer with us, but her achievements are all around us. Much of what we enjoy today, be it parklands, preserved historical buildings, or tighter controls over industrial polluters, can be attributed to her tireless and selfless work over many years. We would like to welcome you all to the lecture and hope you will help to continue to support Nancy's battle for a safe, sustainable and beautiful environment. Thank you for the opportunity and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much. Thanks, John. Whoops, still got the speaker, hang on.
It'll happen to each of us. So everybody has done such better job introducing Ron Honig than I could. I will just say we cannot imagine a better person to talk about the transformations and the vision behind those transformations than tonight's first speaker. Ron, will you join us? That's recording and that's beaming.
I recognise the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, to worship the Mayor of Bayside, Dr Christina Curry, councillors Jenny Muscat, Joe Jansen, Liz Barlow, Clive Hillier, son of the great Nancy Hillier, members of the University of New South Wales, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I first met Nancy Hillier in 1978 when I attended my first community protest. Botany Municipal Council had decided to sack us garbage collectors and give the garbage contract to its deputy mayor. And that was in Lestrange Park. We won that one. And Nancy was then a firebrand. When I was elected a couple of years later at the age of 27, I was elected with a chip on my shoulder. Because those that are locals here know that if you came from East Lakes, where I came from, or Mascot, where I went to school, or Botany, people look down their nose at you. And when you represented your school somewhere else, they'd say, oh, where do you go to school? JJ Carl. They look down their nose at you. And I was determined that they weren't going to look down their nose at the people of Botany any longer. So I certainly had a view as to what I wanted to achieve. But Nancy Hillier was my inspiration. Nancy Hillier had been fighting the vested interests since the 60s. I mean, only in Australia would they destroy the European birthplace of the nation by building an oil refinery and wanting to build a port. No other civilised nation would do that. And this mother, this housewife, led the charge on the greedy developers as they were moving into this particular area. And I just want to remind you that it was no easy feat at that stage to protest. It was in fact dangerous. People were killed when Eden Nielsen disappeared. When the threats were made to Nancy and her family, they weren't just threats to intimidate, because a lot of these people actually followed through those intimidations. And Nancy continued for all those decades to inspire me. You might know it, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, but you don't know its impact and history unless you've got somebody like a firebrand like Nancy Hillier in your ear all the time and telling you what you needed to do. I might have known how to achieve it and have the council achieve it, but it was her inspiration for all those years that affected substantial improvements and protection. I mean, there's one thing you learned from Nancy and you got from me, and that is that if you took on my people, you're in for a fight, and you never took a backward step. And that was for two reasons. One is that you are obliged to fight for the people that you represent. And two, next time they wanted to take on the people of Botany, they would say, Honig's too much of a pest, we'll go and do it somewhere else. So that there was always a method in my madness. And Nancy and the community of Botany always supported that direction, and if you disagreed, you certainly knew about it. The last thing Nancy did, one of the last things she did in her life before she passed away 9 years ago, was insisting on signing a document to give me life membership of the Botany Historical Trust. I mean, she couldn't even get out of bed at the time, but she insisted on signing this document and having it presented to me. And it's something that I value, and is on the wall and framed in my office, and something that I will continue to value. That's why it's so important in these days where people often worry about their own individual problems, that they forget that there is a collective and there is a collective good for everybody. And the collective community needs to stand up, not for things that just impact upon their particular interest, but on those things that impact upon an entire community and a community's future. And that's the lesson that the community needs to learn from Nancy Hillier, and that's why lectures like this are so important. The subject of today is gentrification. What is gentrification? So I prefer this definition, which I'm going to read. Gentrification is a process of neighbourhood change that includes economic change in a historically divested neighbourhood by means of real estate investment and new higher income residents moving in, as well as demographic changes not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of change in educational level or racial makeup of residents. It's a pretty wide-ranging definition of gentrification, but it encapsulates what it is. Now, this area has been embarking upon gentrification since 1770, and the catalyst for that gentrification has always been water. Firstly, it was Botany Bay and the coastline, the ocean that protected the Indigenous Australians for 70,000 years before white settlement arrived on the foreshores. Following 1788, the gentrification that took place here, the catalyst was water. It was always water. It was water because of the Botany wetlands. It was water because of the swampy forests. It was water because of the aquifer and the sandy soil that enabled the aquifer to be constantly replenished and recharged. It was water that was the catalyst for, shortly after the first fleet's arrival, to move down to Botany for Sydney's second water supply. And it was water that in 1810 caused Simeon Lord to acquire land holding adjoining the Botany wetlands, because it was water that was responsible for, firstly, the cloth weaving mills that Simeon Lord began in 1813 to begin to manufacture. It then changed to mill grinding of wheat, then changed to paper. And then following that, a whole range of noxious industries found their way into Botany because of water. And it was water that ensured that a number of other manufacturing industries, large manufacturing industries, established in the Botany district. Industries like Kellogg's or Johnson & Johnson. It was water that caused a number of those petrochemical corporations to locate here. A water course in the aquifer that they poisoned and contaminated, which we still pay the price. We still pay the price today. With those industries that were established in Botany, of course, they had to be serviced by people that worked in them, and most people who worked in them lived here in Botany or in the Botany district. And historically, those industries and residential areas were interspersed with each other. That be the gentrification from wetlands into various industries where people and industries were interspersed. And so it was that there were these massive conflicts between the operations of industry and the lives of the residents. And of course, as part of the noxious industries that made their way into Botany and Mascot were those stinking tanneries and Davis gelatine and a range of those offensive type industries that had no place to adjoin residential areas. But you know what? Over the years, Botany, that feeling that I had when I was elected first to the council, of people looking down their nose at our people, has always been the case. Because if anything needed to be constructed or erected or manufactured anywhere that would not be acceptable in any part of Sydney, they chose Botany as the location. And Botany copped it. And Botany Council tolerated it because it was run by the real estate agents for many, many years. And as long as they could sell or lease their properties, they were unconcerned. And it was in that environment that Nancy Hillier's war started to begin on behalf of the people. And it was that environment, when I was elected, I believed had to change. There had been a hazard study done by Dr. Sam Haddett from the Department of Planning, the first in Australia, that showed that people living in Banks Meadow and Botany lived in an unacceptable area of risk. Within the first 2 weeks of me being mayor, Bayer's, a chemical plant operating in Botany and Wilson Street, blew up, where people had to be evacuated from their houses. 3 months after that, as a result of a chlorine gas leak, people in Hillsdale had to be evacuated from their houses. Petroleum storage occurred in Botany across the road from Banks Meadow Public School. A match and you had dead school children, let alone the residents that were living by it. And so a hazard line was established. And I used the hazard line as a vehicle in which to start to force the relocation of industry. And over a long period of time, and by being persistent and being regarded as the mad mayor of Botany, various industries started to relocate, because I was of the view that people were entitled to live in an area that was safe and not be impacted by the operation of these industries. And I'll give you one example. Davis Gelatine, that operated near Pagewood Public School. They made gelatine by leaving animal hides outside in pits to rot and deteriorate to enable the gelatin to be obtained. And their solution for the stench was to spray perfume in the air. But if the wind blew the wrong way, then the smell went all the way over Pagewood Public School and over to Pagewood. They used to have to close Pagewood Public School because children used to get sick from the smell. And I was told there was nothing you can do about it. I took speculative proceedings in the Land Environment Court seeking an injunction where they said they would remove the smell within 12 months, and 12 months would be up, and they would make an application to extend the time in the court, and then the following year they'd do the same. And I had it marked in my diary. Well, on the 5th year they forgot to make their application to the court, and I took contempt proceedings against them. And there was and I remember the QC ringing me saying they say they're going to move out in a year's time. They're going to move out in a year's time. I said, I don't care, I want the smell to stop. They said, well, Mr Mayor, what order do you want? I said, I want an order that the Goodman Fielder directors be jailed for contempt. And as a result, David Gelatine moved out of their site where they'd been for decades within 3 months. So, you know, you really needed to utilise every string in your bow to achieve those sorts of results. But the other changes in gentrification also occurred with the changing nature of the industry. So I used to fight with the Department of Planning about rezoning some of the industrial areas back to residential that shouldn't be industrially zoned. They were areas that were hazardous and they were areas impacting on residents. They would say you'd lose employment generating land. They wanted the residents to move. I got my way on many instances, but in some instances, some of those changes to the uses of non-residential land had a really significant impact on the employment generating land that was there. And that related to probably one of the most significant developments that occurred here, and that was Port Botany. I mean, the New South Wales government, in their wisdom, who had the world's best natural port in Sydney Harbour, decided that they were going to relocate a New South Wales main port out of that natural port at Sydney Harbour, just so that people could have these wonderful harbour views and that you could return the harbour to the people. Well, it got returned to all the rich people that could build along the harbour. And they relocated the port to Botany Bay and constructed the port at Botany. And that was one of the major fights that Nancy Hillier had as they reclaimed all this land. For those of you that were long-term residents of Botany, like when I was a kid playing golf at Botany Golf Course, if you played the fifth hole and the ball went over the fence, it went in the water. That's where the water was. In fact, I was shocked when I was elected and Nancy took me out there and found a road next to Botany Golf Course and ships out there, because I remember having to go into that water to take out my golf club when I got angry and threw it over the fence. So I remembered the area well as a young person. But apart from those problems associated with the port and its impact on Botany in terms of the movement of freight, it changed the industry. So that Johnson & Johnson, for example, that employed 3,500 local people, became a warehouse employing 7 people. All those manufacturing plants that were basically engineering type workshops that employed thousands of people down at McPherson Street, Botany, became container storage, which employed 1 person on a forklift. So as the land use began to change, we started losing our employment generating land because land associated with the port was not employment generating. One of the things I did try to do, which they wouldn't let me do again, that I successfully did in Mascot. You might look at Mascot now, the other side of O'Riordan Street, where you see the Stanford Hotel and the Pullman Hotel and a number of commercial buildings. Well, they were derelict type factory buildings of which they wanted to construct warehousing, and I persuaded a number of people that I wanted commercial development, because commercial development employs people and brings people into your area. In any event, the Department of Planning wouldn't agree to a commercial zoning, so I created an airport zone which allowed commercial use. Well, most of that area became commercial as soon as you allowed commercial use within an airport zone, as long as it had some sort of affinity to the airport. So the thousands of people you got working down there that you were able to bring into this area were because you could change the commercial zoning. You could change it to commercial that employed people. Warehousing doesn't employ anybody. So I tried to do the same thing in Botany, but the Department of Planning said, no, we're wise to you, you pull this flanker in Mascot, we're not going to let you pull it in Botany. And so a lot of those Botany lands remained container storage facilities and didn't allow the employment generating land that I wanted to create. When you look at, for example, areas like Banks Meadow, for example, that you would like to see have some sort of economic activity associated with it, you actually need people working in that area to inject the money. And had I been successful in being able to get some commercial port-related office facilities in that part of Botany Banks Meadow, it may well have affected the change or gentrification that I was seeking to achieve at that time. The downside of change, or the gentrification that people normally think is confined to simply housing and the cost of housing. The Botany District will suffer like every other district that is reasonably close to the main central Sydney CBD around the world, and that is if you're within 10 kilometres or so of a city, then that is going to impact on your housing costs and your housing prices. And if you create an efficient transport system associated with housing, then of course you run the risk then of only the rich being able to afford to live in those particular locations. So with those changes that have occurred, not just here in Botany, but also the entire South Sydney area or the Waterloo area, when I talk about a transport hub impacting upon prices, when that Waterloo metro station is completed, if Waterloo is allowed to redevelop for the private sector, those places are going to be worth a fortune close to the city, right on a metro station, beyond the price or access of any normal citizen. So this process is occurring, right throughout the world. We're no different. So governments need to find a range of solutions to be able to address gentrification of housing stock. Because if you don't, then you'll have a homogenised living environment where you'll only have one group of people from white Anglo-Saxon, well-off people living within your residential areas. Now, what I believe is that you need to have as a focus of your residential communities, you need to maintain diversity. A diversity of demographics, diversity of ethnic groups, and diversities of ages of people. How do you do that? Well, you can't do that by just leaving it to a market. A real estate property market is actually a market that operates on supply and demand. So the challenge to governments are, and they talk about it in other cities around the world, some are trying to address it, how do you ensure that in the future changes of your residential communities, you can ensure people from a variety of diverse demographics and financial capacity can live within your community and share your community. So that is a challenge, and there are a number of suggested options. Firstly, there is the option of social housing or public housing. Now, within this area, we do have significant public housing, whether it's Staceyville Soldiers Settlement, whether it's areas of Hillsdale, whether they're interspersed houses I know in Pagewood, whether it's East Lakes or some areas of Mascot. We do have within this area public housing, And within the northern part of my electorate, in Erskineville and Waterloo has significant public housing, which the developers are eyeing off, and the government have an intention of throwing out 3,000 people out of their public housing areas. It's a fight that I've been having for 5 years, and they're still there. So the solution is public housing for those people that are entitled to public housing. But what about those other members of the community that are so essential to be part of our community? Whether they be police, or whether they be nurses, whether they be aged care workers, whether they be teachers, whether they be childcare workers, another most underpaid professional group of people, as well as aged care workers. Both of those are grossly underpaid. What's the solution? Well, the solution is intervention into the market. To require, through a value capture method, certain parts of the redeveloped areas to be set aside for those purposes. Now, you can either do that through community housing providers for lease, or alternatively, you can do it by ensuring that there is a price cap on sale of those properties. And those properties, for example, are required to be retained for, say, a period of, say, 5 years, and they have to be sold back to the provider or the government. So in other words, you don't get a bonus to be able to keep a place for 3 or 5 years and then flog it off at whatever the market value is. So you retain it at that value. All those sorts of suggestions have worked in some places. But there needs to be some type of intervention into the market if we want people to own their own place and can afford to live in these places. So either sale or alternatively renting at a subsidised rent. It needs active participation. The only warning I give you is this in respect of it, and this is the challenge governments will face, and God willing, this will be the challenge that we'll face after March of next year. And that is that you cannot do it simply by commanding it. You can't simply do it by passing a law. You simply can't compel it on an investment industry, because if you look at basically the bulk of the high density development that is taking place, there's very much a restricted number of developers that have the funds for that type of investment, and they can afford to sit on their land holdings without developing them. And so, you know, unless you take these developers with you in a partnership, you're just not going to be successful. They're going to say no to start with anyway. So it's not something that governments can do unilaterally. But there is no choice. There needs to be some level of intervention, because as you've seen historically, when you look at what gentrification is, from say, and using this area as an example, from 1810 to 2022, there has been an ever-changing gentrification of this particular area. But the future is, we have to have an objective. That objective is a diversity to ensure that these areas, like the South Sydney area, can be a home from everybody, irrespective of their background, irrespective of their demographic, and irrespective of their financial capacity. So I hope I've given you some food for thought, and I hope that I have done the late Nancy Hillier justice in my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron Honig. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Dr. Jemima Mowbray. As mentioned before, she is a policy and advocacy manager with the Tenants Union of New South Wales, and is somebody who does daily work around affordability and the costs of rising prices for housing. I thought she'd be a perfect voice to share her thoughts about what's happening right now and the directions we need to go. Thank you. So 2 microphones, just in case you were worried about running out of them.
I know. Right, we'll just sit up there. Sorry.
Oh, here, I'll.
Nice,
There you-
nice
perfect.
to be here. Thank
Feel
you.
free.
Sit this here. Sorry, everyone. Hi, everyone. I feel actually very happy to be here, and I really felt like I learnt a lot. Thank you for taking me through quite the history of botany. I hadn't been aware of the history, and that was, I feel honoured to have heard it straight from you tonight. So firstly, I'd like to thank John and the organising committee and Bayside Council for the invitation to speak tonight, to talk to the pressures that increased gentrification and decreasing housing affordability are placing on renters, and how we might start to address these challenges together. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Bidjigal and Gadigal country in the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders of this country. I'd like to particularly do that because Aboriginal people are far more likely to rent. In the South Sydney area, around 3/4 of Aboriginal households are renting households, and because they have experienced displacement since colonisation. They continue to experience displacement disproportionately today, including as a result of gentrification. And they are far more likely as a result to experience homelessness. So I think both John and Clive and Ron have talked a little bit about what gentrification is, and they've also covered off on the negative impacts of gentrification. I think they're quite well understood. Primarily there's this concern around gentrification that groups that are more disadvantaged, those on low incomes and particularly renters, can find themselves displaced. Displacement for renters can occur through direct eviction, or displacement occurs as renters are priced out, as their homes, they see rents increase. Or for some, especially lower income households, as the cost of even some of the daily items such as groceries, maybe recreation options, just become less affordable as lower priced options and local amenities become more limited or just disappear. So, a researcher in urban planning up in Queensland, Dorina Pajani, in her mapping of gentrification in Australian cities, so she actually looked at different Australian cities and looked at what has been happening in the last 10 years, so prior to 2020, where are we seeing gentrification at the moment? And she found that in Sydney, we're actually experiencing an outward spread of gentrification. So a majority of gentrifying areas are located between 5 to 10 kilometres from the CBD or even further afield. We often consider gentrification to be really an inner city phenomenon, but really much of inner Sydney has already gentrified in previous waves. So for South Sydney in this period, so that's 2010 to 2020, Pajani explains Botany, Malabar, La Perouse and Chifley are suburbs identified as gentrifying or at risk of gentrifying. So she had a look at various different characteristics in areas and looked at the mix that you would see as communities gentrified. She said these are areas that are in the process of gentrifying now, but these are not suburbs that we generally consider as impoverished or necessarily generally disadvantaged. Instead, these are areas best understood as undergoing a regentrification. Already comfortable residents are being replaced by an even wealthier wave drawn by the proximity to beaches and the CBD. So her conclusion is the new middle class, a group traditionally associated with inner city gentrification, is unable to access the housing market in previously gentrified suburbs and is now moving outwards. So really, let's bring that back down to South Sydney a little bit more. What does that look like for South Sydney? how are people being housed at the moment? This is my moment for being a little bit tech savvy, but let's see. There's a slide across there. I'm not sure that you can see it, but hopefully most of you can see it. I'm going to take us to the ABS stats to paint us something of a picture of how people are being housed in South Sydney. So, for those of you who can't see, 2021 ABS census stats have just been released, but I'm taking us back actually 10 years, so we can see 2011, 2016 and 2017. This is for the inner city and South Sydney areas. It includes Botany and surrounding suburbs. And we can see in 2011 you had around 47% of households in the area were renters. 2016 this increases really quite significantly to 56.8%. And by 2021 you're looking at around 58, almost 60% of households in the Botany area are renters. So you can see there's quite a shift there. And that compares, Botany has always been, and some of the areas around the inner city have always been higher proportion renters. But really we're seeing across the state an increase in the number of people who are renting their homes. So just as a comparison, I'm not sure that everybody can see, so I'll just, in 2011 it was 47% in the Botany area. Across Greater Sydney, that looks more like 28.9%. In 2016, across Greater Sydney, it's around 31%, and currently it's just under a third in Greater Sydney, it's 34%. So we're probably we're the highest, across Greater Sydney, we've got the highest proportion of renters across in Australia. In New South Wales as a state, we're also we're the fastest growing tenure in terms of renters. I'm a renter myself, so sorry I keep saying we. But we are around a third of us rent across the state. So while South Sydney saw a significant increase in the proportion of people renting their homes over this period, we've actually seen this grow across New South Wales. In South Sydney, as across New South Wales and Australia, there are more renting households with children. It is, in fact, the predominant renting household type, so people sometimes think of renters as young people without families. We know that that's shifted a lot, but sometimes it surprised people that actually, in terms of renters, you're most likely to see a family, a household with kids. The number of older renters, so people aged over 55, is increasing. And with home ownership in significant decline, due to an unaffordable housing market, more people are renting for the long term. So that means sort of 10 years or more. So in terms of those of us who rent, at least 1 in 3 of our households, we've been renting for 10 years or more. And that's certainly my experience. I've been renting since I left home, which is a good 25 years now. So in terms of who the renters in South Sydney were renting from, and Ron touched on this a bit, there's actually quite a reasonable amount of public housing, but you can see that that's also in decline. So in 2011, we had around 16% of people who were renting in public or community housing. It's dropped to around 11% by 2021, and clearly also there's a growth in private rental. And that's not just about, there are some houses that have shifted over from owner-occupiers across to being rented homes. There's also new homes that might be coming online that go straight to renting. But we're also seeing, in terms of the real numbers, that you have a decrease in the number of social housing residents and the number of social housing dwellings in the area. So this decrease is not, I think we all know this, because of reduced need. The waiting list for public and community housing is many years long in South Sydney. It's around 10 years plus. That's like most of the rest of the state, between 5 and 10 years. You're likely to be waiting for social housing once you actually get onto the list. We just don't have the homes that are required. And this trend, a dwindling of social housing stock, isn't just seen in the ABS stats. Data released earlier this year by the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare shows that in 2021, the number of social housing units in Australia rose by less than 1%. Social housing has been stuck at around 4.2% of overall housing stock, and in New South Wales it's slightly higher than this. We've got around 4.7% of all housing stock is social housing stock. That's still a very small amount, and that small increase that we have seen over the last few years, which is why we're slightly higher in New South Wales, is largely because of housing that's been delivered by community housing providers. So renters in South Sydney, like renters across the state, are currently facing increasing pressures in relation to their housing costs. Everyday renters in the private rental market face soaring rents and high energy bills. Over the past year, we have seen rents in New South Wales increasing at a significant rate and by a significant amount. While property values seem to be on hold or even falling just at the moment, in the sale market, low vacancy rates in the rental market means this isn't being reflected in a drop in rents. A very tight market is instead empowering some landlords to test the limits on how far they can push rents, not just when setting the rent when they're listing a property, when it becomes vacant and they go to relist, what's happening in the market, but actually within existing tenancies. So another chart for you here. This is median rents across New South Wales at the moment. They've increased 10.6% since last year. Regional areas of New South Wales, probably most of us are familiar with this story because we've seen a lot of the reports, such as Central Coast, Central West and Murray and the Richmond Tweed in particular, have seen increases of 13% or higher. So that's on average. We're hearing stories of much higher percent increases. Some people are calling up for advice with an increase of $100, $150 per week, which you can imagine takes a sitting household and it just becomes untenable for them to stay. But metro areas have also not been immune. Rents in the eastern suburbs of Sydney increased by over 13%. The Ryde area has seen an increase in rents of 14.9% over the last year, and in the South Sydney area that looks like around 9.6%. So I'm not sure that you can see this across here, and I tried to differentiate it a little bit, but I'm not sure it comes out. But the top line is actually rents in the inner Sydney and South Sydney area. So they're slightly higher. It's an area with higher rents, but they also follow the trend in terms of how rents are travelling or increasing. It seems the lack of housing, so if you have a look at this, I'd like you to think about the travelling of rents here and the increases that we're seeing and compare this to wage increases that have generally looked much closer to 2%. But it's clear, so this graph that I'm showing you actually tracks from 2016 to 2022. It's showing the median rent there. At the moment it's sitting around, I think it's $550 on the main blue line. But you can see actually we've had really quite significantly high rents for quite a while now, for at least 4 or 5 years and before that as well. And in terms of the increase in sitting rents that we've been seeing, I mentioned that the increases that we're seeing are certainly not in line with the 2% wage increases. That has been the case for at least 10 years now. We've seen rents increasing at a significantly higher rate than we've seen our wages increasing. We've actually been seeing rents increase at a significantly higher rate than the rent CPI as well. So the increases that you're seeing are not reflective really of what is actually happening for the households who are making those houses their home. What does this mean for renters, and in particular those on low incomes or in financial hardship? As financial pressure builds, we certainly at the Tenants Union and in the local tenants advice services are hearing from people, they're calling up for advice, who are finding it increasingly hard to cover the costs of their basic needs. They're talking about missing out on food, missing out on having to forego or not go to medical appointments. Energy bills are a real struggle, so they're calling up about rents, but we are hearing about all of the other ways in which it's hitting the household. And this absolutely does mean that people are being forced to leave because they can no longer afford the rent once they get that rent increase letter in the mail. When they look around though, there's very little housing that's actually available to them that might be affordable as an alternative. And that's especially the case. They might see something that they might think is affordable. There's a lot of competition out there. And if you're looking for something that is accessible, or even if you have just some additional requirements that seem to be everyday, like, oh, I have a pet, I have a cat, you're going to find it very hard to find. Not even just alternative affordable housing, you're just going to be able to find it hard to lock in any kind of alternative housing if you find that you are forced out of your current housing. And if you are lucky enough to find alternative housing, you move, but you're actually hit with quite a substantial, significant financial hit. Every time you move, it costs you quite a lot. And that compounds any financial hardship you are experiencing. So if you are struggling to meet rent, and that's why you have to move, suddenly you have to find the resources to be able to actually finance the move that you're about to make. So another aspect of what it looks like to rent in South Sydney, and here I'm going to focus on the private renters. So that's around 90% at the moment of people who are renting in South Sydney. As a renter, you are living with a chronic insecurity that has been allowed to become a feature of renting a home in the private rental market in New South Wales. We know renting households in New South Wales generally move more often than their owner-occupier neighbours. Over 80% of private renters have moved in the last 5 years, a third have moved between 2 to 3 times, and 10% have moved 5 times or more. Up to a third of these moves, so each time somebody's moving, at least a third of the moves that we're seeing in a year, up to between 20 and 30%, are forced moves, so they're evictions. And somewhere between 8 to 10% of those are evictions for no reason or no grounds. In South Sydney, as in many other areas of New South Wales, including and especially regional New South Wales at the moment, as rents increase significantly, we have seen the use of no grounds evictions increase as well, with landlords using these to move on a lower income renter, perhaps do some renovation work, perhaps not, and then significantly increase rents to take account of the current market. We have for a long time been talking about our housing system as being in crisis, and when we talk about that, we're often talking about the lack of affordable housing that's out there. People just can't find housing that is affordable. More recently, housing researcher Chris Munn from UNSW City Futures has made the case that Australia, and this is prior to COVID-19, was already experiencing an incipient eviction crisis. There's limited quantitative data available on evictions in Australia, and the limitations on the data available in many ways underplay the frequency of eviction. But nevertheless, Munn identifies that eviction applications are occurring in both New South Wales and Victorian tribunals at a rate just over half that reported for the United States, where the existence of a state of crisis in relation to eviction is generally accepted. They actually recently considered legislation around an eviction crisis in the US because there was actually, it's understood we are in crisis, we need to do something about the rate of eviction. So what does it mean to be in an eviction crisis? What's the experience of eviction for somebody who is being displaced or evicted? Eviction is a significant, often traumatic event that can destabilise a household and push them into or compound existing financial hardship. So I mentioned there are substantial costs associated with having to move, and often those costs are higher when you're forced to move. We did research earlier this year. We have a report that we put out that looks quite substantially at the different costs that are associated just in terms of the financial costs at the moment, the immediate direct costs involved with moving, and we costed it at around $4,000 each time a household must move. And that's not including the cost of bond. So alongside financial costs, renters experience significant anxiety and health impacts, as well as the increased risk of homelessness. And once you bring homelessness into play, the costs for the individual obviously go much higher. You're looking at really significant health impacts, you're looking at long-term financial disadvantage. But the costs for our governments actually, and for our communities, I suppose, really start to increase significantly. In terms of costs of people evicted into homelessness, Hillier, which is a housing research institute, who undertakes quite a lot of this research, has costed the cost of eviction of individuals into homelessness at around $30,000 each year for each person who is experiencing homelessness. So that's additional services that are required to support the people who are experiencing homelessness. So that's quite a significant cost that we're actually carrying as a community, because we're not doing the work that's needed to prevent some of these very unnecessary evictions. So, at present, eviction is too often relied on. In our current renting system, it's relatively easy for a landlord to evict a renter, and it's often accepted as a standard or common practice. This is so much the case that we currently accept no reason in New South Wales tenancy as in our tenancy law as a good enough reason to evict someone. This ability to evict for no reason, that is to issue a no grounds eviction, has been a problem in our tenancy system for decades. In fact, it was some 45 years ago now that Ronald Sackville, he wrote quite a well-known report into law and poverty in 1976. It helped establish many of our renting laws, identified and clearly recommended against keeping no grounds evictions. Importantly, he recognised no grounds evictions have an invisible rather than an explicit use. So you can be impacted by a no grounds eviction. You might get a no grounds eviction for a range of retaliatory reasons. You might get or discriminatory reasons. You arc up about repairs and maintenance. You question your rent increase. Your landlord can't point to a breach that you've made, but they can give you a no grounds eviction. But this is not the only power it has. The renter, knowing that there's always this real risk of eviction, doesn't have the confidence to assert other rights that we have in our tenancy law. So it really undermines all of the other rights that we do have. So we have some really great rights in our tenancy law. A lot of those cannot be asserted. You can't act on them as a renter because you're always aware you could either have your rent increased or you could be evicted. So solutions. When I look at what is happening for renters in South Sydney, acknowledging that gentrification has likely impacted the community and displaced some of these renters, it's nonetheless really hard to unpack or untangle that from the two crises that I've mentioned, the affordability crisis and the evictions crisis, because these are things that are happening across Sydney, they're happening across New South Wales. These things are happening not just in areas where you can identify gentrification, they're happening to all renters. What do we do to get this changed? I think a start is for us to acknowledge that housing is an essential service. Having a safe, livable, stable home is vital to ensure that you can have a decent life. And then once you acknowledge housing is an essential service, then you need to seriously consider what this means from a regulatory standpoint. And I think Member for Heffron, Ron Honig, has talked about this really clearly. It means as governments, you step in and say, actually, maybe we need to regulate and make sure people can have access to this very essential service. In relation to rent increases and the displacement that occurs as a result of increasingly unaffordable housing rents, it might mean, like other basic needs, other essential services where cost is regulated to ensure that you can have access, so services like health or education or energy, we step in and we say, actually, we're going to regulate the cost of these services to ensure all people can access it. We can and should do this for rental housing. What would it mean in terms of addressing the issue of eviction, the problem of evictions that I put on the table? I think it means we need to step in and think about what stronger disincentives do we need to put in place to stop landlords from so easily turning to eviction. That first step, it's a really easy step, is to get rid of no grounds evictions. It's to say, if you're going to evict somebody, because we can see what significant impact it has for those households, we can see the significant impact it has in communities, then we are going to make sure you have to have a good reason to do that. To finish though, I'd like to take a step back Up until now, talked about the impact on households. To some extent, I've talked about the broader financial impacts that displacement has for governments, especially in the medium to longer terms. But we should also be considering the impact such displacement has on communities. So much to my embarrassment before tonight, I hadn't actually heard of Nancy Hillier, but I did some research. I love a good Google, I love to research. And as a fellow unapologetic whinger, I was immediately impressed with her courage, her tenacity, and her commitment to having community front and centre as part of decision making about community. I also came across some really great archive footage of an interview with Nancy, and in it she remembers her childhood in the Botany area. So some of you may have seen this, I'm sure many of you might have seen this, but I'm going to take a quick moment to read some of the transcript. So she explains, I came over to this side of the harbour in 1932 when I was 8 years of age. It was a mixture of country and sea, it was a child's paradise. There was a beach there that children could go to with no fear of drowning. You'd see the cows being driven home of an afternoon and the vegetable gardens were widespread all over the area. And it was a treat to go down and get our vegetables from the Chinamen. As kids, we all used to love to go down and talk to the Chinamen. It was lovely to see the Chinamen working in their gardens, and we could appreciate that time how hard they worked for those gardens and botany. Botany at this time, the tanneries and the wool washers were beginning to move out of botany, and this indeed was progress, but we didn't know that they were moving out to create room for worse industry to come. I love that little bit of barb at the end. It spoke to me as I was listening to this, because it also has the images. I used to ride by this all the time of the gardens where a whole lot of produce is grown. But when I heard Nancy Hillier remembering her childhood in botany and talking with affection of her familiarity with the place, with the cows and the gardens, the Chinamen at work, the wool washers and the sea, I heard in her reminiscing the importance of the interdependent, cooperative relationships and mutual support that we lay down, often quietly and over time, with daily routines and sometimes quite anonymous interactions, quiet interactions with a place and within a community. And I was struck by the often unseen impact of eviction in creating distance between those who rent and others in the community. When people are evicted or forced to move, when they're displaced by rents that have become unaffordable, they are too often pushed to the margins, and many kinds of margins. This is not just that people are displaced and pushed farther out to the edges of our cities, but they are pushed away from family, from local services and supports, from community. And I think sometimes we don't really recognise the displacement involved, and with it the isolation and the dislocation that can occur when someone is forced to start again, to re-establish this sense of belonging and that sort of sense of real familiarity of knowing a place. This is really quite exhausting work, and it's work that too often confronts renters. We find it much harder to put down roots and invest ourselves in communities and place, generally because of this precarity, this lack of security that we experience in our housing. We know at any point we could be forced to move, and this is a logical, really an inevitable conclusion of a housing system where housing is not valued primarily for its use, its value as a home, but in terms of the exchange value it has as real estate. So it's actually in the strength of community, this familiarity. It might be close connection to your neighbour. It might just be that familiarity that I think comes out in her reminiscing of knowing something, having that routine. I want to, I suppose, talk about the strength of that. I mentioned that one of the solutions that has to be put on the table that we can't ignore is the need for government to deliver more social housing homes. The current model of increasing housing stock, Communities Plus, a program of renewal, does not deliver the increase in public and community housing that we need. The model does not involve residents in respectful participation about change, and is a very clear example of gentrification. It displaces and disrupts established communities and networks. But in the response, and apologies, I think I forgot, because this is one of the first pictures that I came across when I started my research. And I loved it, because as I said, I'm a bit of a whinger. I love a good strident photo out the front of a home, telling people what's what. And I really did love this quote, because it speaks to me. A country's wealth must be assessed by the living conditions of its people, and not be judged by how many millions it can boast. And the pictures reminded me of the strength of community. The pictures reminded me of activists that I know in public housing organisations who have been really strong, who have come together, who have stood up collectively. I think that was a great reminder to talk about what they want to see. I think community is a real resource, and that's what we're going to have to use. We're going to have to draw on that to put the challenge, to make sure we can push through the solutions that I think we've actually really usefully already had a couple of speakers, I'll include myself, put forward. And I think really that kind of community and the challenge of standing up together when we put the challenge, it's about being part of the conversation about what your community should look like. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just as an aside, when I put this together, I was thinking, we'll get an academic, we'll get a brilliant and passionate activist, we'll get a legendary politician. But one of the things that I've been so moved by is that both speakers we've heard from are able to talk about the big picture, and when they talk about the big picture, they see people. They see actual individuals. And when they think about those individuals, you can see that they see that invisible fabric of community that links individuals. And it's such a lovely thing. And this is so true for our next and final speaker, Alan Morris. Alan is a towering theorist of urban housing and affordability, and an author of a major volume on gentrification and displacement. Alan, thanks you so much. And so this is for the recording.
Oh, okay. Good.
You can't have too much technology. If you want to use this to hold your notes, feel free.
Right. Just
And you can just clip that on.
Okay. Thanks very much, John, and thanks very much for the invitation. Much appreciated. Sure, tough being the sixth speaker. I'll try and make it as exciting as possible. John asked me to talk about gentrification and the Millers Point displacement, but I think I'll leave out the gentrification and I'll just go on to Millers Point. I watched the video earlier today of Nancy Hillier, the 11-minute video. That was really incredibly inspiring and impressive. Jemima, I'm going to put in an ARC application on evictions. Let's hope. Fingers crossed. Okay. So I'm going to leave out all those beautiful slides, and I'm going to move on to Millers Point. Sure. Usually I have the big screen here. This is quite taxing. Okay. So Millers Point, I mean, people probably are a bit familiar with the displacement, but I'll just go through it, and I've got lots of photos which will hopefully keep you going. So what happened was, on the 19th of March 2014, the minister responsible, Prue Goward, announced that all of the approximately 580 public housing tenants were to be moved. Absolutely no exceptions, however old, however frail, however long you've been living there, everybody was to be moved. This was really an example of what I would call administrative evil. It was unbelievably brutal. The sales were justified on the basis of the money that would be raised from the sale would be used to build 1,500 public homes. But I think this is really an example of where the human cost is completely dismissed and everything is measured in terms of finance. And this is, I think, in terms of policy, a really dangerous premise. Millers Point was really a very, very important area historically, probably the oldest public housing area in Australia. It was built for waterfront workers at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was an incredibly strong community, because what you had in Millers Point was that it was a very unusual area in the sense that it was intergenerational, the housing. So a lot of the houses, the public housing, which was first controlled by the Maritime Services Board, etc., and then was taken over by Housing New South Wales in the mid-1980s. But prior to the mid-1980s, it was intergenerational, so families would inherit the public house. So you had these families that had been living there for decades, 5 generations, 4 generations, 3 generations, etc. So this created intense place attachment, an intense sense of community. And what happened was I was invited by the Tenants Committee to look at the impact of the displacement, and that's so it's a real privilege. So I was able to interview people who were still there in 2016 when I came, and also people that had moved, and that's very unusual in terms of research, because when people are displaced, they usually disappear. You can never see them again. So, it was really very, very privileged to be able to interview people who had been displaced and see the impact. Now, oh, goodness gracious. Okay. I've got no control over that. So this, one can see, thanks very much, John, why Millers Point became a site of, why the state government wanted to move it. You can see the position, quite incredible, right next to, right near the Opera House, right near the bridge, etc. Serious, an incredible view of the Opera House, etc. So an area in very high demand. The other thing about Millers Point is that the public housing was extremely well built. It was very, very, it was very solid. The design of the public housing really created, or facilitated neighbourly interaction. People walk up the stairs, see their neighbours, etc. God, this thing's automatic. It created this, and also another factor which really facilitated the growth of very, very strong community. So this is Windmill Street, the street before that's High Street. Okay. This is a very interesting quote. This was one thing about Millers Point, which I don't think people realize, is the whole area was declared a heritage area in 1999, and that's very, very significant because at least the houses can't be destroyed. If it wasn't a heritage area, probably would have a whole lot of high-rises at this point, etc. So in the assessment of significance linked to Millers Point being declared a heritage site in 1999, the assessment states, its public housing and its development into a government corporate town were probably the first such developments in Australia. Its unity, authenticity of fabric and community, and complexity of significant activities and events makes it probably the rarest and most significant historic urban place in Australia. And of course, they go and destroy it. It's just incredible. And then the Sirius building also, of course, has a very, very important history. The Sirius building was built in response to the moratorium on the green bands. It was part of the agreement and was used to settle public housing tenants that had been moved with the development in the rocks. And once Sirius was built, it was only opened in 1980. It was also an incredible building in terms of design. It had 4-bedroom apartments, a couple, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, meeting places. So it also facilitated this incredible sense of community. And nobody moved out of Sirius. Once you moved in, you stayed. Besides the view, it was an incredible place. Okay, so why the decision to move the residents. So I think it's premised on 4 interrelated phenomena. Deindustrialization, closing of the ports. So what you had, as Ron was talking about, the building of Botany Bay, the closing of East Darling Harbour, which now is Barangaroo, the closing of Wharf Bay, which is now very fancy apartments, etc. And linked to that, of course, was dramatic increase in property prices over time. And then you had these spectacular developments, Walsh Bay, opened in the 1990s, and then of course Barangaroo. And Barangaroo was really the killer. Once Barangaroo got going, there was no way that Millers Point public housing was going to be retained. I mean, you pay $60 million for an apartment, you don't want to look over public housing. So I think this was really crucial. And then I think you also had this very, very ardent neoliberal government, which is really, as we know, determined to privatize every public asset that's going. I mean, and public housing is not seen as a positive. As hundreds have been sold off in New South Wales. There's an absolute refusal to use general tax revenue to build social housing. Any social housing that's built, the money is obtained by cannibalizing existing social housing. So it's really, I think it's part of this ideology. The government argument, of course, was this high maintenance costs. Some of the housing was inappropriate, was true. Some of them were very steep, and that the money would be used to construct these 1,500 dwellings. But what they could have done, they could have negotiated with the residents. People who wanted to stay could have stayed. And of course, the prices have gone up now, so they would have made a lot more money. And waited till people, a lot of people were very elderly, and waited till people passed away, etc. They could have done it in a far less brutal fashion if they were so determined. Okay, so this is the site of Barangaroo before it was developed, and this is it more or less now, I think. But now they want to put another tower there, I think. Never ends. Okay. So the process, I don't really talk about the process, but the process was very, very sophisticated. It was very, very difficult for residents to resist, because what they did was they gave residents 2 formal offers, and they had these specialist relocation officers. Each relocation officer was allocated some tenants that they were responsible for moving. Some of them were very nice, but some of them were quite brutal. But basically their task was to move the residents. And residents had 2 formal offers, and they were told, if you reject your first formal offer, your next formal offer might be much worse. You could land up, in the very far away from the CBD. Most of the people in Millers Point have lived in the inner city their whole lives, so they were very, very, very resistant to moving to a peripheral area. So most people accepted the first offer, and the movement was quite quick. There was about 100 people who really resisted right to the very end. Okay, so now what I want to talk about a bit is the impact on residents. Now, certainly the impact was not uniform. It was there were a lot of people who had come to the area quite recently, and of course their place attachment was far less than many residents who have been living there for decades. So it did vary. But for a substantial proportion of the community, the announcement evoked incredible distress and anxiety and depression. And people really sunk into very serious depression, I would argue. So I would argue that the longevity of residents, the homogeneity of the residents, the physical structure of the area, all combined to create the foundation for incredibly strong social ties, mutual assistance, and intense place attachment. I think in many ways, Millers Point was an absolutely unique community. I just don't think you find it, it's very, very unusual. And many of the interviewees, as I say, they use this expression as like a family, like a village. This was such a common phrase. And the other very, very important aspect is that it really enabled older people to age in place, because people really looked out for one another. They had these signals, like if you didn't see the blind come up in the morning, you knew that there was something wrong, and people would go and check up. And if somebody was ill, they would be taken to the doctor. If they couldn't shop, their shopping would be done for them. Food would be brought for them. So it was a real community which enabled people to really age in place, which if they were living in normal suburbia, they could not do. So here are a couple of quotes. Joan, 68 years old, I've been living in the area for over 50 years. I've been in a present home for 25 years. I don't think I've been the same person since the announcement, emotionally, I've been a bit of a nervous wreck. I've been angry and I can't sleep, been to the doctor, so you just think, what's life all about? So you have your depression and you have your sleeplessness and you have, and you all seem to talk, and all you seem to talk about when you run into anyone is all about this. It was really, it just swept people off their feet completely. It was just completely devastating. Single parents also loved Miller's Point, again because of the incredible support which was given to single parents. So this woman was living in Miller's Point, had been there for about 10 years with her 2 children. After the announcement, for 2 weeks, I just remember I didn't want to get out of the house, but I had to. It was like a grey cloud, literally. It felt like everything is so grey, and then I thought of harming myself, of doing something drastic, and I thought I've got to make sure that I let people know why. So I think this is, so significant in terms of policy and government. When they do these things, there's no, they've got to think through what impact it will have on individuals. So David, 86 years old, he died a couple of years after being moved. Miller's Point was like one big family. Everyone knew everyone, and if anyone was sick, they'd help out. And if you didn't see someone in the traps or in the streets, they'll be asking how they are. I found it very good in Ken Street. You sit out there and you read the paper, and people would come past and have a yap and all that. Just being able to walk down the street to the pub, and you always know someone's there. Have a couple of drinks, walk around the streets and bump into someone. You could always go down this road and meet someone to talk to. We each knew each other's interests and what to talk about. Those friendships build up over time. It doesn't happen overnight. So this, completely, once he was moved, he was totally isolated. Nobody. Okay, this is the last one about the impact. The impact of enforced loneliness and loss of community. So this person most of the people were moved in the inner city, but this person had been moved quite far out because she had held out and she was basically punished. She was moved to Ryde. She had quite a nice place, but she knew nobody. Amy had been moved to an outer suburb. The relocation is a very long process, that's for sure. In the meantime, I just get more and more depressed, living out here where nobody comes to visit and my right knee does not like me driving and I cannot afford to drive. I'm so depressed beyond belief. She followed this up with another email, so I was in a bit of email contact after the interview. The loneliness and loneness is beyond my mental capability. I have spent so much money here and I have tried so hard to meet people around this area and tried so hard to say beggars can't be choosers, so hard, I just can't take it anymore. Very, very sad. So in terms of resistance, okay. Modern technology. Resistance was very, very difficult. It was quite limited. Although there was a very strong committee, because of this whole pressure around these formal offers, most people moved fairly quickly. And within about a year, there were only about 120 people left. As I said, the government employed these specialist relocation officers. They won a prize from Housing New South Wales for the best team. The government, very, very important, the government refused to meet with the residents. So there was, we're supposed to live in a democracy. This was the most incredibly authoritarian move. They just refused to meet with the residents. And this, before the announcement and after the announcement, eventually Brad Hazzard became the minister, and to his credit, he did meet with the residents. That was in July 2015, but by that stage, most of the people had moved. Gabriel Upton refused to meet with the residents, as did Prue Goward. Prue Goward, I think, only lasted about a month after she made the announcement. So the community tried to mobilize support. They did, from the city of Sydney, trade unions, NGOs, etc. And they did form a strong movement, but it just wasn't enough. And as you can see, in the middle of that photo is our Prime Minister. A lot of politicians became involved. Anthony Albanese was there, Tanya Plibersek, Clover Moore was very supportive, etc. But nothing helped. These banners really capture the spirit of the resistance. Community Millers Point, not for sale. This says, the value of our community worth more than just money. This says, live in the city, working people need homes here too, save our social housing, Millers Point. And of course, what has happened is that Millers Point is now probably amongst the top 5 most expensive areas in Australia. I think the median house price is around about 3.5 million. So, what they've done here is really destroyed social mix. And, that's an important feature of any city, should really encourage social mix. I've used this word community-side. I've tried to get it into the English language. Basically, the destruction of community. This is what they did. So there were marches, etc., but ultimately nothing helped, although they did delay the removal. Prue Gard was very determined that everybody would be moved in 2 years, but the last person moved in July 2018, Sally Parsley. So they did delay it by a couple of years. This is a photo. On the left-hand side is Cherie, who was the second last person to move Sirius, and then you have Myra in the middle and Maureen. Myra was the last person to leave Sirius. When she left, she was 92 and blind. They moved her into Piermont, where, of course, when she was living in Sirius, she knew the area, and she was quite a remarkable individual. I don't know if anybody met her. She used to go out every day. She knew her way around. She could get around, although she could hardly see. She couldn't see the view from her apartment, which was absolutely magnificent. And when she moved into Piermont, she fell after a few weeks. She broke a few bones, moved into aged care, and then declined and died about a year ago. Cherie was moved to Redfern. This is another photo of Myra. So every night she used to put these lights on, SOS, Save Our Sirius. She was a remarkable individual. And this is Sally Parsley. Sally Parsley is living in Annandale. She was the last person to move. She launched a legal case to try and forestall the removal. The lawyers really tried to find a legal angle, but it was really impossible. And ultimately, she was forced to move in July 2018, the last public housing tenant to move. Okay, so I know time's moving on, sure. Okay, I'll just conclude very quickly. So I think what the interviews show is that, gentrification and displacement, the human costs can be absolutely dramatic and should be avoided if it were possible. This is especially so in the case of older residents, who have lived in the same neighborhood for most of their lives. They really are dependent on their neighbors, people that they know. So I would argue that displacement can result in dangerous levels of isolation. And I think it does impact on life expectancy. There have been a couple of studies. It's obviously very difficult to study in terms of methodology, but there have been studies that have indicated forced displacement does impact on life expectancy. So echoing, I think Ron said a similar thing. I can't really see where I am, but anyway. Susan Feinstein, who's a very good urban scholar, defines a just city as a city that is premised on democratic decision-making, the maintenance of diversity and social mix, and the minimization of inequality. And I think the Millers Point situation really reflects everything, is that exact antithesis of this. Totally undemocratic, accentuated inequality, and destroyed social mix. And so I think it just really accentuated the growing divide in Sydney between the rich and the poor. And I think the Millers Point serious building displacement really captures the very ugly side of gentrification. I'll just conclude with these two incredibly powerful quotes. So this is Barney, was really the de facto leader of the committee. Yeah, and the way they look at it, they don't look at us as people. We're looked as by the government as a commodity, because they say, quote, well, like, we've got what's going on here, we can get rid of these people. And then this is what they talk about all the time, the value of the property, the money side of it, and no one seems to be worried about the human cost of it, the human side of it, the human cost. That's his quote, I didn't write that. Really, I mean, incredible quote. And then the final quote. Conclusions. This was said by, sorry, I changed, I'll have to go down because I changed it. Oops. Yeah, Cherie, okay, I haven't got it down there. A real community, and this is what kills me, to think that it has been torn to pieces, to destroy this beautiful community where everyone cares, loves and respects one another. And we come together in times of need, always, and it's just, I can't believe that it's happening in my lifetime to live through a government like this. The state government, the arrogance of them, they're heartless, soulless, and all these tactics that they have. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
So
pleasure.
I'm gonna ask Alan and our other two panelists to come up. We have a little bit of time if you have questions for them, or I'm also going to open this up to our panelists. If you have questions for each other, this is actually an opportunity to both talk to concerns or ideas that people in the audience may have, but also engage in potentially a conversation amongst each other. Now, of course, the technology is going to be a little wonky, but we'll do our best to work with it. So let's start with anybody in the audience have any questions for individual members of our panel or the panel as a whole, or things you just want to talk about. I'll come down and I'll bring you a microphone.
I live in an area where now, for years, next to our area, we have horses. Warming Market Gardens, which is a Chinese market's gardens, has been there for 132 years. It's one of the last still producing food for supermarkets and other places. It's essentially, mostly, what the large parts of Sydney used to be. Single-story houses, blocks around maybe 500 square metres or smaller or bigger. It is the last lot in this part of the city area for the onslaught of the high-rise maximum medium density. And I've watched what's happened at Millers Point, all those areas which were fought by the green gangs. I grew up with green gangs in those periods of time. And I've watched the destruction of those areas, and I see the destruction of my area now starting by gentrification. High rise, this absolute insanity of squeezing as many people as we can on these 5 city versions. And we're a country sitting on 7.7 million square kilometres of land. And the insanity of that is that, coupled with this destruction of social housing, and I grew up in a social housing. I lived in Lawson Street, Paddington, down next to the tennis courts, and I lived in public housing. My mum was in public housing. My sister was in public housing. But I moved out of public housing because that helped me get through the transition in life. The problem now see is, apart from reversing the destruction of public housing and these communities, is it a time for us as a state and as a country to do a couple of things? We refuse to allow developers or parliaments to rezone areas like agricultural zones inside the Sydney Basin, because we can't feed ourselves. It also takes away opportunities of employment from local farmers. Is it time to make sure that we don't allow high-rise developments like Mr. Triggerov, who's worth $19.4 billion. I don't know how much money you can jam in your coffin before you go out the door. He wants 25-storey buildings at Little Bay. I was in a campaign for 14 years fighting to keep Prince Henry Hospital because we wanted a hospital there for not just the local area, but right across the metropolitan. It was the largest laundry. It employed large amounts of people in the area. That public infrastructure. We got rid of it. Liberals started, Labor finished it on car to get rid of it because we wanted to flog off the land. And we got rid of the laundry. The laundry was one of the greatest employers of semi-skilled and low-skilled workers, including a large amount of Aboriginal people. Both Aboriginal people and European workers. But that was a community. Isn't it time for us now as a state and a nation to do those things? You can't transfer and change agricultural land into developments for high-rise. You can't build on certain places where there is floodplains like they have in the Western Sydney. You can't destroy these social things, but that's going to take government change. I think there's one other thing I'm asking a question all through. There is another driver of this, the white elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. Isn't it time in our country, like a lot of other countries, Pacific Islands do it in other countries, is to make sure now we bring in federal and state laws for a couple of things. State laws I look at, if a block of land or a building is vacant for a certain period of time, and it is not being utilised for a public good, like in England, the local council and state government will say to the owner, you will now rent it for social housing for a set period of time. They'll get the money for it and everything else. Is it also time that we now ban non-citizens from owning residential properties in our country? Because one of the drivers I see is 16 to 18% of private ownership in this country is now controlled by non-citizens. And a large amount of those non-citizens, for ABS figures, are not even resident in this country. They don't even live in this country. They just buy the property as a place where they can park there so if something happens overseas. Now that's all good and well to be the beacon for the rest of the world, but it doesn't do anything about our people, and it doesn't do anything about the 118,000 people who are homeless on the street every night in this country. Now, there's a couple of questions there. I'd be interested in some of the answers. It's what we can do, and do we need to do that, or am I wrong?
Who's in the mood to start on this one? Ron, thank you. I'll give you both of those.
The last part of your question I remember, Richard, so I'll address that. There is a fundamental problem in terms of all the land banking that has been going on. If you talk to Mr. Triggerboff from Meriton, he will tell you, quote, I build for the Chinese, close quote. So in other words, he's developing for overseas investors. If you look in various parts of my electorate, for example, you walk through Rosebery in 9 o'clock in the evening, you'll see the lights aren't on half the buildings, St. Dominic Avenue, and the curtains aren't drawn so that they're empty. The state government adopted a policy, actually advocated by Steve Camper, the member for Rockdale, to increase stamp duty for foreign investors in the acquisition of properties. It didn't act as a deterrent. So there are policies, for example, the UK used to tax empty dwellings. I think it's the UK. I certainly know they do it in New York. And I think that's something governments need to address, really. There are a lot of empty vacant properties that are being land banked. People like Meriton, for example, can afford to hang on to them because they're cashed up. They don't borrow any money and they can hang on to those properties or turn them into serviced apartments as well.
Problem. I was just going to say, I think absolutely there is a need for us to reapproach how we think about housing and how we plan within our communities to make sure that we have access to all of the things that we need. Housing, obviously, I have an interest in, but you know, the infrastructure and the services and the supports and the green spaces that we want as part of our communities. And I think I mentioned, you know, we think it's really important to talk about housing as an essential service, as essential infrastructure, but I think that often gets lost because so often we talk about housing as property. And so I think part of this is a different solution or a different approach to reapproaching what housing is and how we value it in our communities is talking about our current tax settings that really ensure that, or have promoted the idea that housing is property as an investment, as an asset that you watch, and it forgets that use value, you know, what we actually use housing as, and what most of us as renters experience housing as, it's a home. And I think the tax settings that we have in place, for example, capital gains, the capital gains discount and the negative gearing that we have in place mean that you know, we don't have a whole lot of actually landlords in there for the mix is interesting, but there are some who are in it for the rental income. There's a whole lot of people who are owning property investments because of the capital gains at the end and because of the current kind of benefits that you can get from that. And that has a really clear effect on the behaviour of landlords, and it has you feel it as a renter and you experience it as a renter. People talk about, well, if you want security, why do you keep talking about no grounds evictions? Why don't you talk about long-term leases? I mentioned that I've been renting for a very long time, for a good 20 years. I'd be happy to stay a renter. I probably would like to shift over to own a home just because, despite being very supportive of renting, I'm the policy and advocacy manager of the tenants union, I'm really worried about what happens when I get old. I've seen all of the research. I know what the statistics say and I know what it looks like to retire and be renting. So of course in the current system, that's not working. So I lost my train of thought. I'm sure I was onto something.
What is the question?
Yeah. Long leases, thank you very much. But the reason that long leases don't work is a lot of investors are not really coming into the market for that rental income. Absolutely, a good renter is an absolute asset. I'm a good renter. I'm going to go to my landlord and ask them if I can have a 5 or 10 year lease, because I would love that 5 or 10 year lease. I have a family. They're going to say no because they need to keep that property. Their property is there really for the capital gains at the end, and they want to be able to make sure they can sell it when they need to. It's not really the landlord's fault. They've been told this is how you use an investment property. I think it's really about starting the conversation again about what is housing for? What do we think? What as a community do we want to say housing is about? Is it about being an investment property, or is the value that we place on it as a community? Is it about it being your home?
Okay.
I'm sure you have something to say.
Yeah, I think. Okay. I think what is required is, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think there should be a target as regards social housing. 10,000 homes a year or 15,000 homes a year to try and create a reasonable social housing profile. Because at the moment it's becoming more and more residualized. In order to get into social housing, you have to be so severely disadvantaged, and it's creating, obviously, so social housing becomes more stigmatized, etc. So I think that's one aspect, and I think policy should be driven by social justice and trying to create a more equal society. I think housing is becoming such a crucial mechanism in terms of accentuating inequality and division. And that, you know, between outright homeowners, people with large mortgages, and private renters, and then social housing tenants and people who are homeless. And I think we really, as a society, we need to start addressing that. One thing I just want to say very quickly, I was amazed. I mean, I don't know if the latest census, about 10.7 million, I think 10.7 million private dwellings, of which on census night, over 1 million were unoccupied. Quite incredible, and close to 10%. So that is a mystery.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and a very important presentation. This is probably for the last speaker more than anyone else. Has anybody determined how many new places were found for public housing as a result of the seriousness of Miller's Point? What did you call it? Did you call it something? What did you say? Something side?
Community side. Very good, very good.
How much money did it
No, I'd realised a fair amount of money, about $700 million, I think. And 1,500 homes have been built. So they did stick to that side of the bargain. The committee did make them publicise the building, so you could actually follow the progress of the buildings. But the thing is, most of them are in the periphery, you know. Very few are built in the city of Sydney. I think 20 maybe. So, you know, it's a problem because obviously people become excluded and marginalised. You know, if you stick people in the middle of nowhere, then it's very difficult for them to find jobs, etc., etc. Oh, okay.
I'm just going to jump in quick. Of course, I'm just going to answer the last question just real quick. It's a quick addition. Sorry, it's just to say, I think what we saw with the activism of all of the community organising and the voice that was given to people in Millers Point meant that transparency was actually available for the sale of properties at Millers Point. I've tried myself to track, actually, you know, we see all of these announcements about how much money is being invested in social housing, how many properties come out of these, the way in which they fund social housing at the moment is through renewal. We talked about Waterloo, there's something about to happen across at Riverwood as well, where they'll displace tenants and quite a significant proportion of the land goes across to private dwellings to finance new builds, but it's really hard to track. There's very little accountability in terms of how many homes are actually delivered in a particular period and how many are appearing when we see this going on. So it sounds like there are really clear announcements. We'll get this many homes. Planning does change over time, but I'd love for you to go and have an explore of what information is available about when homes are coming online, when social homes are being delivered, and how much is being delivered in what areas. It's actually that lack of accountability is. I'd love to see more data published so that we as a community can be tracking what's happening and where these homes are coming online. Sorry.
And we'll do one more question, just because it's coming.
You're talking about accountability. Nobody here has mentioned strata living as such in this area. I've, in the last few years, lived in strata building, which is 30 years old. I totally know those strata conditions in Victoria. It's alarming to see where the maintenance, how the maintenance is organised. I don't think they're critical.
demographic area. There's more people coming into the country with a lot more money. They're moving into places. I remember in the 90s living in Bondi, and I remember all the Maoris who used to live in Bondi were pushed out. They went to Dee. You guys got a comment on population growth with respect to gentrification in city environments?
We add one more thing there. Volunteering seems to be dropping off. And you know, what are these underprivileged areas you're talking shining lights, but anyway, I'll just leave it at that, just make a comment.
Can I just say, planning policy dictates also the demographics, and the planning policies that Waverley Council had under the leadership of Paul Pearce, Ernie Page, Barbara Armitage, particularly were designed to retain a lower demographic, the Maoris as you call them, or to retain what they always talked about was affordable housing. I can tell you that also had a political consideration in the decision-making process, but I thought it was a pretty effective way of doing it. You can, as I say, you can through planning policy have some influence in holding out or ensuring a diversity. Very difficult within, say, 10 kilometres of the CBD. The solution is, part of the solution is that the government who owns its land, not just to flog it off to private developers. Landcom, prior to this Conservative government, had a social obligation in terms of the provision of its provision or the sale of its land. That social obligation disappeared with this government, where they were required to, return profits from the sale of land. That immediately in itself changes the demographics. So if you want to know where the Maoris are, it's part of specifically allowing redevelopment in Bondi of higher demographic people that has played its part in pushing them into other areas.
Well, at the time it wasn't actually redevelopment, it was purely new people coming in, buying houses out, and rents going up and pushing us out. I mean, we were pushed out to Randwick, and then we bought it Randwick, and then we got pushed out to Kingswood.
And then you end up in Botany. Thank you.
So what with that, what I would propose is that we have the hall for a while. I propose this actually be part of, we break it informally and we can continue the conversation. But before we end the formal part of this, we actually do have one announcement. I'd like to invite Mayor Christine Curry to come up to do a quick surprise announcement. And so your hands are free. I'll hold the microphones for you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Look, we just wanted to take this opportunity, because it was quite fortuitous, that today is actually the day that our local MP, Ron Honig, was elected to Parliament 10 years ago. And we wanted to We wanted to, yeah, it was, it's good, isn't it? And we, on behalf of the Bayside community, we wanted to thank you for your contributions, not only as Mayor for 31 years, and we heard a lot about your contributions tonight, but also representing us in the Parliament of New South Wales. So thank you for your service on behalf of our community.
So as we get a couple photos, what I'll say, thank you so much for engaging in this essential topic. I hope this is a prompt for greater conversation. We'll see if some of our panel can stick around to talk to you informally. I will certainly be around. Otherwise, eat, drink, be careful out there, and thank you for coming this evening.